clear, based on not only the vector of attack, that is how the attack was executed, what we know, what's been revealed publicly, as well as sort of what's happened since, that this has got to be a foreign power and it's not a criminal network. Why do I say that? Because the government now, in response to this, has been looking on the dark web. There are websites in which, if it had been a criminal enterprise, the value in that information is to sell it, and you sell it on the dark web. That hasn't happened. We haven't seen that. And so that really, by inference, suggests that it's a foreign power that understands very well the value in that sort of information. My information was stolen, as were all sorts of very senior government officials. And at all levels of government, it's particularly valuable to a foreign power because, of course, those people leave government, they come back in a different administration at senior levels, and those documents contain sensitive information about your financial background, your neighbors, your family, the sorts of information folks often use as passwords for bank accounts and other things, children's dates of birth and names, those sorts of things. And so it's incredibly valuable to a foreign intelligence service, and I think based on what we know now, there's a good degree of confidence that it's a foreign power. So I think it's, again, pretty clear that folks in the government and experts who've looked at the information believe it's China. It's the remaining question is whether or not you can connect it to actually the Chinese government. And that's the last step. But it's hard to imagine, with the control and the sophistication of the Chinese authorities, that it could have happened from their soil without their knowledge and permission. And so I think that there's a pretty good sense that this is certainly the Chinese government, if not actually having committed the attack themselves, used a proxy from their soil. You know, I have to say, the current administration has done a number of things that I think we can say have not been very effective. You know, indicting members of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the recent démarche. You feel good when you do them, but you don't expect it's going to have much of an impact. There's got to be a means by which the United States, engage the Chinese on this issue candidly. Look, intelligence services are going to do what they do from both sides, but there's got to be sort of some reasonable understanding about where the boundary lines are. And there hasn't been a really good direct conversation. Oftentimes those sorts of conversations begin in what you and I know as a track two, that is formers. So former government officials, the Henry Kissingers, the Sam Nuns of this world, are able to engage former Chinese officials. That has begun. The question is, can that gain enough momentum and become substantive enough to form the basis of a government-to-government dialogue? Well, look, I think some of this has got to do with attribution. As I said to you, it's not entirely clear, although people have some degree of confidence. The other thing is, we have to be careful about escalating it. We and the Chinese are both among the most sophisticated cyber actors in the world. And what you don't want to have, if you think back to the Cold War, we didn't want a miscalculation in terms of nuclear deterrence. This is kind of the new nuclear, if you will. Right. And so what we cannot afford, because of the huge potential for economic consequence in the current environment, is to have a miscalculation. And I think that's the real concern. So, you know, we tend to, after some catastrophic attack has happened, like 9/11, we appoint a bipartisan, congressionally appointed commission. We give them all kinds of legal authorities to conduct hearings, to review documents, to interview government officials, to try and understand why something catastrophic happened. And so, having been in government and sort of answered the demands of those, I think we need to have a mindset that what we want to do is have those commissions before there's the catastrophic attack, to try and build bipartisan consensus about the sorts of measures we need to take. You know, this is an election year, and so the suggestion has gotten very little attention and very little traction, much to my frustration. I had hoped after the OPM breaches that it might get more. I mean, this is work that could be done in advance of a new administration and to provide a blueprint to a new administration of either party. So I haven't given up, but I am disappointed that in this political environment, the substance doesn't seem to get much attention. I do think we need to try and, in the interim, rebuild the relationship of trust between the private sector and the government. In the wake of Snowden, we talk about the U.S. government capability that was lost, the secrets that have been exposed, and how that's been to the advantage of the bad guys. What we don't really talk about is what that did to the relationship between the private sector and the U.S. government. Frankly, I can't overstate for you, in a world where technology is being sort of advanced at lightning speed, the government needs to have a partner that they can talk to. That doesn't mean that the private sector is going to do that at the expense of their shareholders or their fiduciary responsibilities. They're not. But there's no reason not to have a dialogue. How does the government train and recruit real expertise in the technology area? What are the kinds of issues that the government should be anticipating to be able to fully execute their legal authorities? Those sorts of dialogues are happening less and sometimes not at all. CEOs are unwilling to engage. And so I really think we have to begin now to rebuild that relationship.
And there are...
I don't think I'll ever be satisfied.
Good. Okay.
Because I think that what you've got to accept is that will forever be a work in progress, right? Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber, right? We saw the visa request fall between the cracks of agencies. I can remember when the new administration came in, John Brennan, who took over my old White House job for President Obama. He's now the CIA director. But when he came in, he very graciously invited me in for a conversation. And I can remember saying to him, it's the least glamorous thing that you do in the White House is to make sure the agencies are talking to each other. But if you don't do it and you don't work on that every single day, they won't do it. It's just an unnatural act, right? Everybody's focused on their information and their mission.
Still fine.
That's right. And so it requires human beings at a senior level to pay attention to it. They're doing much better. You also have things like the National Counterterrorism Center that are coordinating and sort of, as we used to call it, connecting the dots. But systems still don't talk to one another. And so if it requires human beings to do it, then you have to work on it because it's sort of not a guarantee. I have a different appreciation now that the private sector has a responsibility to their shareholders, to their owners. Their primary responsibility is not to the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. That having been said, if there are things that they can do in their normal functioning and be good corporate citizens and participate, there's an incredible sense of patriotism and generosity in that way in the private sector. And most people inside government, if they've never served in the private sector, don't quite know how to make the ask. They don't know what it is they're to ask for. I'll give you an example. So FEMA really, at its essence, is a supply chain organization. There's a crisis and they've got to move tarps and water. They've got to move supplies quickly to the area of crisis. Well, there are companies throughout the United States that manage international supply chains as a core function of their business. They have deep expertise. And the answer is, I think, by and large, we need to have a better, more healthy exchange of talent between the private sector and the government. There are impediments to that, but they're not hard. They're just sort of bureaucratic. We do that with academia. Professors can come into the government for 2 years and then go back and not lose tenure. We need to do the same thing, and we need to attract mid-level talent and expertise, whether it's in technology or supply chain or communications, and have those folks come in, not lose their sort of career track in the private sector, but populate the U.S. government with best business practices.
Interesting.
And so they can take, and then they will take back to the private sector their own knowledge of the government, which will make them more effective. It's interesting because they have a different sort of focus, right? Al-Qaeda tried to keep secret their communications, their objectives, their goals, other than to say they wanted to fight the West. ISIS, we know, sort of promotes their own propaganda. Horrific as it is, they loudly proclaim it. And so we've seen beheading videos, the burning of the Jordanian pilot, the sorts of things you wouldn't have seen out of Al-Qaeda. The Islamic State focuses on what I call the near enemy. So they're very focused on establishing the caliphate. The caliphate for them is real. They're fighting for actual physical territory. Al-Qaeda, the enemy was the far enemy, the West. The caliphate was notional. Because ISIS has made the actual physical establishment of the caliphate a priority, it's fueled their momentum. It's attracted foreign fighters to the tune of 20 to 30,000 of them to them. And so ISIS, the Islamic State, has a different sort of DNA, if you will. In some ways it makes them a juicy target. The other thing that makes them quite different from Al-Qaeda is the internet and the way that they've leveraged the internet. We think of a physical battle as being air, sea, space, right, land. Well, the Islamic State has made the internet a battle space, and they've made it one that forces us, frankly, to adjust our thinking about that. We must defeat and deny them that battle space just as we try to do others. They use it for recruitment, training, propaganda, the dissemination of bomb-making equipment and materials. And we've not really challenged them in the way that we do in other physical spaces. Some of that is our own constitutional DNA about freedom of speech, but there's no constitutional protection to a beheading video. And it's enormously damaging to us, to our national security, when they can literally sit in an internet cafe in Raqqa and send that stuff over here and inspire or recruit a lone wolf or cell to carry out an attack like Chattanooga or the one in Garland, Texas. And so I really think we're playing catch up there, and that's been a real advantage for the Islamic State that Al-Qaeda never really understood. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we fully understand it. By and large, I think these are folks who feel alienated from the societies in which they live. You know, I always thought that the melting pot of the United States has been, in many ways, our great protection. Right. It's not true with our European allies, where immigrants feel like second and third class citizens or have watched their parents treated poorly. Mm-hmm. They've not had the same opportunities. In some ways, I do think that it's a protection. It has been a protection here in the United States. But even here, people feel alienated and feel denied opportunity. And the urgency, the sense of urgency and the success, the actual establishment of the caliphate, gives people a sense of belonging. You can come here, there's a role for you here, you're serving some higher purpose. And so while it's an anathema to you and I, this is something we're going to have to contend with for a long time. Some of this is we're dealing with the effects of what is a fundamental struggle inside Sunni Islam. I think there is a battle between Shia and Sunni, between sort of the pillars of Iran on the Shia side and Saudi Arabia on the Sunni side, but there's also a struggle for the heart of Sunni Islam, all the way from a more moderate sort of interpretation. There is, at the most conservative end, a Salafist interpretation that's right in Saudi Arabia, and then beyond that there is the Islamic State. And really, this is for the Arab world to resolve, and we are collateral damage, if you will. We become victim by being sucked into this. So I put the cyber threat right up there. We talked about, there are things that I think we need to be doing now, like a commission, like a threat commission, like the exchange with the private sector. Counterproliferation, I am deeply worried about an increase in proliferation of nuclear and nuclear-related materials. I think with the Iranian deal, we already see the Sunni Arab states talking about acquiring nuclear capability. And I think and then you look at a sort of mature nuclear capable state like Pakistan, and you look at unrest there. So I worry across a very broad spectrum worldwide about proliferation issues. President Obama has had this nuclear security summit. He's increased sort of dialogue and cooperation worldwide about that, and that is much to his credit. But I think we really need to understand as a global community how we're going to deal with the inevitable proliferation issue. We are going to continue to, Ray Odierno, before his retirement, the Army Chief of Staff, talked about the terrorism and the Islamic State as being a 10 to 20-year battle. Part of that is fueled by the largest refugee crisis the world has ever known. There are 11 million all in, either displaced persons or refugees out of Syria alone. That's the next 2 generations of Islamic State recruits. These are people who feel abandoned, denied by the West, inadequate housing, medical care, and education. It is destabilizing to our partners in the region. And so when I think about terrorism and the future of terrorism, you can't separate that out now from the refugee crisis. I didn't expect as a counterterrorism official I'd be worrying about a refugee crisis. I think I can't address the counterterror problem without addressing the refugee crisis. And so it's a humanitarian disaster that absolutely I think we will be dealing with over the next 5 to 10 years. And then we have I hadn't even gotten yet, I've named 3 and I haven't gotten to the sort of bread and butter foreign policy issues. The rise of China. I think we've got to think there are serious issues we have to address with the Chinese, and cyber's among them. But we have to sort of come to grips with the idea of dealing with China as a rising power that will be of serious economic weight and significance, as opposed to viewing it, as I call it, through foreign policy straws, the South China Sea, the cyber issue. We have to deal with them as a strategic partner and engage them as a strategic partner. And I worry that it's become, the public dialogue is becoming increasingly acrimonious, and I don't think that's helpful or good. I worry about Russia, and I worry about Putin. I worry about not only Ukraine, although I have immediate concerns about Ukraine, but about our Eastern European allies and the growing aggression of Russia under Vladimir Putin. And I think we have to be talking about that at a strategic level. We can't just shut him down. He has to be dealt with as a strategic partner. And we have to confront the issues that concern us, and we have to look for ways in which we can cooperate with him. And I guess the last piece, I think it's unfortunate that there's a whole generation of people who've grown up in a post-9/11 world who look at the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, North Africa, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, as this sort of chaotic, conflict-prone area, and know it only otherwise as the oil producer of the world. I must tell you, they are very important strategic partners. And if I had to add one last issue to the list, I would encourage thinking about a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. That doesn't necessarily mean that the levels of funding that we put into the Marshall Plan, but we must lead. And this is a difficult, problem-ridden area that with our European allies and our partners in the Middle East, we ought to have a multi-generational plan and commitment to that region. They will not have democracies, Jeffersonian democracies that look like ours. We will have issues in which there are serious differences of opinion. But at a time where we've struck this historic deal with Iran, our traditional Sunni Arab partners feel, I think, in some respects, abandoned and forgotten. And I think we need to renew that commitment that will sustain us across multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat. Climate change has got to be on the list of long-term issues, right? Because with increasing temperatures, we will inevitably see more natural disasters. And with more natural disasters becomes increasing sources of instability and chaos, areas that are ungoverned or poorly governed, and we will be drawn into conflict. And so the area that, it's funny, when I think of the environment, the first area that I think of as a source of conflict is water. Water is a national security issue. You look at it between Egypt and Ethiopia, but you can point around the world. The Islamic State in Iraq has used the Mosul Dam. Right. You know, the Palestinians have had water denied to them, fresh water, by Israel as a source of leverage. I mean, water as a source of conflict is the part that I think of first when I think of climate change, but it's all the environmental impact on populations, especially when you look at where population growth is going to be around the world. Water as a source of conflict is a great concern to me.
I remember during the first Iraq War.
You know, I think that the world misses American leadership. That doesn't mean the United States setting policy for the world. It doesn't mean the United States necessarily having its way in terms of, or deciding what a particular outcome should be. But I will say, you look at a place like Libya, where the United States led a coalition and then walked away from it. And what happened? Libya is in complete chaos. There's the rise of extremism. It doesn't have a functioning government. And the world, this coalition, which had a positive effect in its initial phases, has left this country and its people in a far worse position. I'm not advocating that Gaddafi should still be there, but we cannot engage in conflict and then throw up our hands and walk away. Yemen under Saleh was a reasonable, if imperfect, counterterrorism ally. Yemen itself is now a complete disaster. And I really do think we've got to get out of this. I can remember being in Afghanistan and traveling and meeting with Afghan forces, counter-drug forces, police forces, and they would shake their heads. They'd made enormous progress, and they said, you'll go. You're not going to stay. Okay. And that is our reputation. And so I really think American leadership and American fortitude across administrations. Look, presidents get elected because of their policy views, and they ought to come into office and implement those policy views. But there are certain things that are sort of immutable in terms of our fundamental values and principles. And it's important that the world feel a sense of stability and leadership from the United States that's been lacking, in my judgment. And so, as I think going forward, it's fortunate organizations like PSA and the notion of instilling in folks a career sense of public service, right? The career masses, I was one, really provide the stability and continuity to our government that is fundamental for political leadership to succeed. It doesn't matter about party. That core career public service is what provides the stability so policymakers can make decisions at a national and international level. And so leadership is really important, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Yeah, I agree with you.